Hello, everyone. And we haven't started yet, but we want to make sure that you can hear us. I'm here with Steve Kaufmann. Hello, Steve.
Hello. Good morning.
Good morning, good afternoon, wherever
Good
people are
afternoon,
in the
depending on where
world.
you are. Yeah.
So, this is a quick sound check. If you are
Right.
watching us live, let us know in the chat if you were able to hear both Steve and Di, and we'll be right back with you. This is a quick sound check. If you are watching us live, let us know in the chat if you were able to hear both Steve and Di, and we'll be right back with you. Sound check. This is a quick sound check. If you are watching us live, let us know in the chat. And hello again, we are back. This is the Language Learning Summit live. We had a wonderful opening session an hour ago, 2 hours ago, for an hour. I lost track of time right now, but I'm super excited to have our first live session presentation for all of you, and I think you're going to enjoy it a lot. Remember that we want your participation in the chat. Participate with your comments, with your questions, and let's get this conversation started. Hello, Steve, again. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Paulino. Nice to be here.
Great. So, Steve,
Yeah.
we met many years ago online, but we met in person recently at Langfest in Montreal. Yeah, that was a great time. Did you enjoy it?
Exactly. It's interesting because if I remember correctly, we argued about something back 10 years ago.
Oh.
And it didn't prevent us from becoming friends, but we argued about some issue related to whatever, language learning and stuff.
Let me see if my
then,
t-shirt, let me see if my t-shirt can remind you what it was. What color is my t-shirt?
Green.
And what language is associated with green?
Oh, Esperanto.
Yes, we have these discussions about why learn Esperanto, but that is all gone. We can talk more later about it.
Exactly.
But it was great to meet you at Langfest, and we had a great time there with a lot of presenters. It was good to meet you in person and see your presentation there and being part of the panel. And now I'm super excited that you accepted my invitation to be part of the Language Learning Summit.
I am very happy to be part of it. Language learning has been, particularly I would say, in the last 10, 12 years of my life, it's been a major passion. Throughout most of my professional career, I was a businessman. I was, 7 years I was a diplomat. I had, need to learn languages, but I was never quite as focused on language learning as I have been the last 10, 12 years of my life. So I'm always happy to connect with people who are interested in languages, who are enthusiastic. And Paulino, if you are anything, you are enthusiastic. So I'm happy to be here.
I try to be enthusiastic. So you just started to talk a little bit about yourself, and today you are here to talk about how to make authentic content into comprehensible input. So everybody open your notebooks. But for those of you who still don't know much about you, tell us a little more about yourself and, of course, some of your projects.
Okay, well, I'm retired or semi-retired, if you want, although I put a lot of effort into my latest project, which is Link, LINGQ.com, a language learning platform. But I like to say that when I was 16, I could communicate in one language, English. And today I speak 18 languages. My latest language project is Arabic. So how do you get from one language to 18? And if I reflect on it, I realized that it was always this interest in the culture, interest in some aspect of the language. It began with French. And eventually my interest in French movies, I lived in Montreal, but Montreal in those days was 1/3 English, 2/3 French. The two didn't communicate. If you didn't want to learn French, you didn't have to. But then I got turned on, but I got turned on because of not the language so much as what was behind the language, the culture, the civilization, books, and so forth. I ended up going to France, and I took my university degree in France. And the next language that I learned was Chinese. And here again, if I compare myself to the other students, I was a diplomat at that point, so I was a diplomatic language learner, and I learned twice as fast as anyone else. And the reason was that I spent so much time going to bookstores looking for readers that had, word lists behind each chapter. But I pursued content of interest to me. It was political content, or it was literature, or whatever it was. Similarly, when I subsequently lived in Japan, I remember listening over and over again to this. NHK is the Japanese public broadcaster, and NHK put out the series of in those days, small cassette tapes on the history of the Showa era. Showa era, the Showa emperor who came to power in the 20s. So it covers the whole political content, and you have actual excerpts of radio broadcast stuff. And so all of this stuff. Similarly, when I, for example, decided to learn German, I got a hold of these cassette tapes again, and it was interviews with people, authentic, real interviews with real people. And so I think in my own case, and even, most recently in Ukrainian, for example, I found audiobooks with the corresponding ebook on Ukrainian history. So it's always been, and in Russian there was, of course, Tolstoy, and I mean, I could go on and on, Italian, Spanish, all these languages. I was always driven by my interest in something. And I think when we say authentic content, that's what we mean. Authentic content is something that was not written or produced or developed for the learner. It's something that was developed for the native speaker of that language, so that it gets you into something that is real. And the other thing about authentic content is that it should be interesting to you. And I think that I get a great sense of satisfaction from knowing that I'm accessing something that was designed for the speaker of that language. And the question is, how do we get, obviously when we start in a language, we don't understand authentic content. We don't understand movies. We don't understand newspapers. We don't understand the radio. Even authentic conversation, okay, we don't understand it. Even if we learn to say, hello, how are you, my name is, that's not authentic content. Authentic content is all of a sudden you're in the middle of a group, they're all speaking a mile a minute, and you can actually, understand what they're saying. Then you are involved in an authentic content situation. So how do you get from zero in the language to where you can actually interact in an authentic manner with the language? And that brings us to this concept that Steve Kaufmann always puts forward, which is comprehensible input. In other words, you have to get to where this authentic content, lively content, interesting content, motivating content becomes comprehensible. Because if it isn't comprehensible, I see no benefit. Like there are some people who say at work I put on the Spanish radio and it plays in the background. That never has done anything for me. It's just if somebody's playing, I'm trying to learn Arabic. If they put on the Arabic radio in the background, I wouldn't understand anything. I might pick up the odd word. To me, that is not going to get me. It's not going to make that content comprehensible. So the question is, how do you get the comprehensible input? The difference between sort of authentic content and beginner content or learner content, to my mind, is the vocabulary, because authentic content uses a lot of words. It's not the grammar, because beginner content has the same grammar in it as the authentic content, but it's the words. And also it's the speed. Typically authentic content, they don't slow down for you. No one, if you're in a natural conversation, people are not going to slow down for you. So it's the level of vocabulary, it's the speed at which it's spoken, and typically the length. For example, on Link, which is where I learn languages, the beginner content is 30 seconds long. And that 30-second content, I have to listen to it over and over again to even start to understand what's there. But authentic content, you know, when I was doing more Russian, I would download a 20-minute interview from FMSQ, which is this opinion website. 20 minutes. If I'm advanced enough in the language, I'm dealing with authentic content, I'm still learning and improving and acquiring words, but I'm able to deal with 20 minutes. But when we start out, it's 30 seconds. So again, the difference between learner content and authentic content, in my opinion, is not the grammar, but it's the vocabulary level, the speed at which it's spoken, and the length, the bite, the size of content that you can actually deal with. So how do we get to where we can listen to a 20-minute interview with lots of vocabulary spoken at natural, you know, speed? And I think there, my strategy, and I think different people can have different strategies. I tend to use Link because that's my website. That's what I'm comfortable using. I start out with beginner content, which in the case of Arabic, which is what I'm doing right now, I have these 60 stories, which are mini stories. It's the typical, you know, different point of view. In other words, they are simple stories where the vocabulary repeats 3, 4, 5 times within the same story. And I have listened to these 30, 40 times. So at an initial stage, I find that repetitive listening to stories, it has to be a story. It can't just be phrases. It can't just be disconnected vocabulary. It has to be a story that hangs together. I prefer a story that says Mary went to the store to buy some shoes. She looked at some green shoes and blue shoes and red shoes, and she decided to buy the blue shoes. Simple story from daily life, using the most common verbs, okay? Like give, take, want, decide, and so forth. These kinds of stories, I can listen to them 30, 40 times. I'm building up some sense of fluency in the language, gradually building up some vocabulary, and then I will reach a point where I can now try to take on a newspaper article. The second thing is you need some assist with the vocabulary. So in the old days, when I was learning Chinese, every chapter or lesson had to have a vocabulary list. I'm not going to look stuff up in a dictionary. It's simply too time consuming. And as we all know, the minute we close the dictionary, we have already forgotten whatever the meaning of that word was. So you have to have some other method. As I say, it used to be I had this vocabulary list that I would learn with each lesson that I was reading. But nowadays, of course, we have the online dictionary. Link has a variety of functions that connects you to an online dictionary. You create flashcards. You can either, fill in the blanks, or you have dictation where you hear the word and you have to type it out. And there's a whole bunch of other things so that there is some method to help you acquire the words. And in that regard, where Stephen Krashen and others say that we should only deal with material that has 5% unknown words in order for you, this is this extensive reading, comprehensible input, all of that is fine in terms of developing fluency in the 95% words that you already know, and it's important to do. You have to go over and over. However, at 5% unknown words, it's going to take you too long to acquire the words you need. Because when we start, we have 100% unknown words, but you can't start at 95% known. So that's where systems like Link or people who use Memrise or Anki or whatever it might be, you need some kind of an assist so that you can deal with more than 5% new words. Because you have to get to I consider a sweet spot as I'm kind of developing to where I can really work with authentic content is like 15% unknown, 20% unknown. When I was doing Russian, I was 40% unknown. Because the biggest factor in terms of making something comprehensible is, are you interested in it? Do you have some familiarity with the background? Is this compelling in some way? If the content itself is interesting enough, if you're familiar with it, if you like being in that environment, as I was learning Russian, I was so happy to be in the Tolstoy environment. I didn't mind dealing with 40% unknown words, which gradually, using LINQ, I got down to 30%, 20%, 10%, whatever. So your interest in the content is extremely important. So if I summarize, to get from sort of, to try to make comprehensive or at least authentic content, which hopefully should be motivating to you. Again, authentic content, fairy tales, children's stories are authentic content. But I'm not interested in children's stories. So therefore, that's not good, authentic content. And by the way, I've never found children's stories to be easier in terms of vocabulary than, say, something about news, because I'm actually more familiar with the news item than I am with some fairy story about the crow and the fox and all this other stuff. So authentic content of interest to you, which to me is a great motivator when it comes to language learning. In order to get there, you have to have a strategy. And I believe that the strategy is to move from learner content, which we can't avoid at the beginning because it's simply too difficult to go and bite off something like Tolstoy when you know nothing in Russian. So you have a strategy of using this beginner content, and how long you stay with that beginner content is up to the individual, and it depends on the language. If I, for example, I now have learned just Portuguese, but if you're going from Spanish to Portuguese, you can jump into authentic content pretty quickly because the vocabulary is essentially the same. But if you're going to Greek or Arabic, obviously you need a much longer period of time in the beginner content before you can approach the authentic content. And even when you start to chew off some authentic content with a high percentage of new words, I find it very useful to go back to that beginner content again to kind of work on the phrases and the structures and things that you have started to acquire but haven't really mastered. So you're kind of mixing. And at some point, I think each learner, based on their interests and based on their pain threshold, will gradually move into more and more authentic content and less beginner content, because after a while, they have no interest in the beginner content. They've gotten rid of their training wheels, and they're now motivated not by the desire to learn the language so much as they're motivated by their interest in that authentic content. And at that point, now you're flying. You're flying, but you're still flying at a very low altitude, because in order to be comfortable with authentic content, comfortable watching movies, comfortable interacting with people in a variety of situations, you actually need a lot of words. And while the high frequency words are acquired quite quickly because they come up all the time, there are very important words in the language that appear 5 times in the whole book. So you actually have to consume a lot of authentic content in order to build up your vocabulary so that you can then comfortably interact with the native speaker. Because no matter how many words I may know, for example, in Spanish, Paulino knows more words than I do because he's been listening to Spanish since he was a child. So he will use words, he will use a much broader vocabulary than I do. So in order to be able to defend myself, even if I can't use as many words as Paulino can use, I can understand what he's saying. So again, I get back to the point that vocabulary is very important. Passive vocabulary is very important. We build that up through this, our hopefully enjoyable engagement with authentic content. So in other words, to summarize, you begin with sort of beginner content. At some point you decide, I'm ready to take on authentic content. I've built up enough familiarity with the language, occasionally referring to grammar, but without the grammar being up front. And now I feel more and more comfortable with the authentic content, and now I'm on my way towards fluency. So I hope that wasn't too confusing. It's largely based on my own experience, and I've done it for a number of languages, and I'd be very interested in any comments and questions.
Definitely. I have a question for you later about stories. By the way, I do love fables and I do love children's
Okay.
stories. So,
Yes.
partially because I work with them. So, I
Okay.
live in their imagination. So, we can find interest in many different ways. But I
Absolutely.
do have a question about stories. But, Scott, you mentioned a little bit of your process of working with different stories, but he has a specific question about a story about your current level. He says, Steve, how do you approach a new story that is at your current learning level? Do you read first, then go back and look up words that are critical to comprehension? Or do you read straight through just for the gestalt? Or do you repeat the same material then or later? And how about listening to the same material that you're reading? So, a few questions related to just one
Okay.
story and what you do with it.
Okay. Let's look at it depends on the language. Okay. Right now I'm dealing with Arabic, and I would say that my experience with Arabic and Greek, which are the two most recent languages that I've learned. When I say learned, I spent time studying. I can't call myself, proficient. It depends. You see, listening to me is where I spend most of my time because it's something I can do in the car while I'm working out in the gym, while I'm doing the dishes, cleaning up. Yesterday, I had to assemble a piece of furniture that my wife bought. She always creates work for me. And I'll be listening to Arabic while I'm doing it. So listening is the easiest to do. So if I have had the chance to read a story first, I may read it first. And typically, because I'm now in Arabic, I'm dealing with these mini stories. They're 4 minutes long, and essentially the same vocabulary repeats 3 times. The first story is Paulino went to the store, Paulino bought shoes. Then it says, I went to the store, I bought shoes. And then it says, Paulino went to the store. Did Paulino go to the restaurant? No, he went to the store. So the vocabulary repeats over and over again. So with these stories, it doesn't really matter to me. Sometimes I'll listen first, sometimes I'll read first. It depends. If I have dedicated study time at home, I read and I say words and phrases and things. I will never sit down and just listen. The dedicated study time is for reading and saving words and phrases, and also the activity, dictation, flashcards, and stuff like that. That's dedicated study time. Listening is wherever, whenever. And I can usually sneak in half an hour to an hour of listening every day, regardless of what I'm doing that day. Whereas when I find the dedicated study time, it depends on other things that are happening in my life. However, if I were to say I wanted to read a Spanish novel, for which I also have the audiobook, well, then I just jump right in because I know I have enough vocabulary that it's really not a problem for me. And that would be the case for even in Russian or Ukrainian or any of the languages that I know fairly well. I just jump right in, and I might listen, and there's some words that I didn't quite get. Then I'll go in very quickly and look through, and of course, at Link, any new words in there will be highlighted in blue. So I can zoom forward to those words that were new to me, and I might, have a look, what was it that I missed. So it depends entirely on the level. Insofar as how often I listen, again, at Link, because I moved my story to a playlist, I actually track how often I listen. And so I know that with my Greek stories and now with my Arabic stories, those stories that I really understand well, I have listened to 30 or more times. I sort of come up with a rule of thumb. If I haven't listened 30 times, chances are it isn't instant meaning for me. I'm still missing words and trying to translate. So actually, and I'm very much a beginner in Arabic, as a beginner, I find that you have to listen repeatedly. Whereas once I'm past kind of, intermediate B1, B2, at that point, I want to devour more stuff, more content. I don't listen repeatedly. I think if we look at the European framework, I don't know if the viewers are familiar with it, but let's say in the beginner stage, you listen often. Intermediate stage, you might listen once or twice. And once you're more advanced, you only listen once. So I don't know if that answers the question.
It got there. Yes, I got the answer. I got the answer. We do have another question from Diego,
Okay.
and he says, "Do you think learning content can be also authentic context by selecting easy and very used vocabulary expressions of the language?" or not
Okay.
possible?
Certainly, beginner content can be interesting. Learner content can be interesting, but it's not authentic. Authentic, by definition, means, to my mind, something that was designed for the native speaker. That is authentic content. But it is possible that, like these stories that I'm listening to, which we have in like 15 languages at Link, they were written specifically to use high frequency verbs. They repeat the same vocabulary over and over. So they are called a typical learner content. It was designed for the learner. That doesn't mean they have to be boring. So learner content can be interesting. Depends on the interest of the learner. But learner content is not authentic content. Also, I am not a great fan of deliberately introducing certain expressions, because if the expressions are that common, they will appear. I am a fan of making sure we have high frequency verbs, because most of the time, need, want, give, take, come, go, all those kinds of top 100 most frequent verbs, we really need to get a handle on those verbs if we're going to be able to speak. I also think that some of the most useful, sort of call them the, connector words, because, therefore, on the other hand, those are all, you want to get those in there. But beyond that, trying to focus on specific idioms, stuff like that, I'm not a great fan of doing that. I think you basically in the beginner material, you focus on verbs, pronouns, adjectives, and then once you're into authentic content, all the rest of it is going to come up. Because, the idea that there's a shortcut is what I'm against. In other words, you have to consume a lot. You have to read a lot, you have to listen a lot, and if you do that, all of the words and phrases that you need are going to come up. Now, you do need some system for saving them for review, which we do at Link, and possibly people who use Memrise or Anki, they put them into some other system, so that as you come across these things, and you look them up and you save them, you have a chance to review.
Great, and thank you for mentioning a link. We do have a link to Link
Okay, very good.
in the resources at the Language Learning Summit, so people can check it out among the many resources that are there for language learning. And thank you for creating that resource, because I do know that many people find it useful not only to find authentic content, but also to bring in authentic content from other resources and be able to manage it, which sometimes is hard with the vocabulary and the progression, how many words you know, exact things like that. So to wrap things out, I want something you mentioned throughout your presentation today, but because I am a storyteller and you talked a lot about stories, I wanted to ask you to a little more focus. Why the focus on stories? And you mentioned it a little bit here and there, but as we know in language learning and even learning about language learning, repetition is important. I would like to hear a little more why the focus on stories.
Okay. The advantage of stories, and I think I'm going to step back, okay? First of all, one thing I wanted to say in my presentation, which I forgot to say, is that authentic content, you have to go out and find it. You have to become a hunter of content. If I remember when I studied Chinese, I would be constantly looking for content. So once you have a certain level, you're out there hunting for more content, searching for stuff of interest. However, to get up to that level, you need help. You need the training wheels. And the thing about stories is, and why I'm not such a big fan of fables and stuff like that is, and where I like the mini stories that we have, and it's not something that I developed. I think TPRS people, Blaine Ray, perhaps yourself, others, you can design a story so that the vocabulary repeats from slightly different points of view. It can be a question, it can be a negative, it can be the third person, the first person, which may not matter so much in English, but matters a lot in Spanish, so different tenses. So you can introduce more or less the same vocabulary in different forms. The challenge for the writer of the story is to come up with something that is of interest. Now, since everybody is interested in different things, you're interested in fables, I'm not. Yeah, it's going to be hit and miss. Some stories may strike the fancy of some learners and not of the other learners. But the story is a format for introducing basic vocabulary and structure. It's better than the conventional learner book with, the scenario at going through customs, the scenario at the bank, the scenario where you visit the doctor, all the stuff that you see in all of these normal learner books, where there's 12 or 20 lessons. The advantage of the story approach is that you can create more repetition within the story, and you can have more stories. And what I like about our own mini stories, and I'm sure I've seen you in a classroom type of environment, you can almost spontaneously create an unlimited number of stories. And so you're no longer limited to the 12 or 20 chapters in a Teach Yourself or Living Language book. And you're not dealing with, as is often the case with living language or Duolingo or whatever, that there's just these disjointed sentences. You're actually dealing with a context. Slightly artificial, but if the storyteller is clever, it can be made interesting, even though it's not authentic content. But it's a controlled environment with a lot of repetition, and it's reinforcing stuff as the learner then starts to become accustomed to the language. That's my view of these stories.
Great. Steve, I want to really thank you for spending time with us.
Not at all.
I appreciate always your expertise. People who don't know much about you should find you on Twitter, on Facebook, because you're always putting content out there that is beneficial for teachers, classroom teachers, online teachers, and of course, language learners of all levels. So thank you so much for being part of the Language Learning Summit.
I participated.
Great. Thank you so much. And I encourage everyone to check out the content. Definitely go to link and see the resources there. And the contact information for Steve is on his page if you want to continue with this conversation. Thank you, Steve. And thank you, everyone, for watching. And I'll see you in the rest of the Language Learning Summit. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.